Crete is a place where history and myth blend so closely, it's often hard to separate legend from reality. This island is now part of Greece. But in the Bronze Age, it had its own life, spoke its own languages, developed its own traditions, and for some reason attracted incredible attention from its neighbors. The Greeks viewed Crete as distant and mysterious. The land of Minos and the labyrinth of the Minotaur is an image we are used to seeing as a fairy tale, but there is actually something behind this myth. A civilization that arose before the Greek one built huge palace complexes, traded throughout the Mediterranean, and amazed its contemporaries with art unlike anything else. Greetings, you are on the Amazing History channel. Thank you to everyone who supports us and helps new videos come out. Our sponsors, patrons, and everyone who watches, likes, and shares our videos. And today we'll try to figure out who the Minoans really were, the first advanced civilization of Europe, or a mysterious culture that we continue to read like a closed book. Let's go. Saying Minoans makes it sound like we're referring to a well-known people with a distinct language and clear history. But this is one of the biggest misconceptions from 20th century archaeology. British archaeologist Arthur Evans coined the term Minoans when excavating Knossos in the early 20th century. He needed to name the culture somehow, and he chose a name from the myth, King Minos, the labyrinth, the Minotaur. Scientifically, the link between myths and actual people of Bronze Age Crete is very weak. But the term stuck, and since then we've called an entire civilization by that name. The paradox is that we don't even know what these people called themselves. Moreover, it's unknown whether it was a single people or several different ethnic groups who lived on the island at the same time. Archaeology suggests a complex picture, different burial traditions, different pottery styles, different centers of power. The language situation is even more complex. We have two writing systems, Cretan hieroglyphs and Linear A, and both of them remain undeciphered to this day. We can read the signs but don't grasp what the words mean. And most importantly, neither of these scripts resembles the Greek language, which means that the culture that flourished on Crete for almost 2,000 years was not Greek. We know much less about the Minoans than we would like, but what has been unearthed over the past century and a half gives us the opportunity to reconstruct an amazing, vivid picture of their world. Rewinding Crete's history before the grand palaces of Knossos and Phaistos, we enter a time without kings, frescoes, or complex bureaucracy. This marks the end of the 4th and start of the 3rd millennium before Christ Egypt's early kingdom is forming, while Mohenjo-Daro's future civilization emerges in the Indus Valley. On Crete, everything appeared modest, small villages, simple houses, farmers and herders. But it was at this time that a quiet revolution began on the island. Small Neolithic settlements started to grow. People no longer lived in tiny, scattered communities, and the things they used every day were changing as well. Instead of rough, unpainted pottery, ceramics with ornamentation and paint began to appear, which means that people now had extra time and resources, not just to survive, but to make things beautiful. Archaeologists see another important point. Settlements began to appear not only on convenient plains, but also in the mountains. This indicates population growth and a denser development of the island. All of this is the early stage of what scientists call the palace period, meaning the time before the appearance of the famous palaces. It lasts for about 1,000 years and is divided into several stages. But for us, the logic of the process is more important than the labels. At the very beginning of this period, society in Crete looked quite equal. The graves of ordinary people and the elite are almost indistinguishable. There are no giant tombs and no obviously luxurious burials. This is a world where wealth had not yet been concentrated in the hands of a narrow group, and the social pyramid was only beginning to form, but gradually the situation changes. Around the 29th to 27th centuries, before common era settlements grew, crafts became more complex, and with them, the first symbols of power appeared. The famous Minoan seals emerged, small stone or bone seals, rings with miniature drawings. They could be used to mark vessels, goods, and clay documents. If you have your own seal, it means you have something to protect and something to manage. and that already hints at an elite and governance. At the same time, more and more items of non-local origin begin to be found in Crete: jewelry, rare materials, imported ceramics. These are signs that the island is gradually becoming part of the Mediterranean trade network. Crete does not yet dominate the sea, but ships are already sailing back and forth, and along with goods, technologies, ideas, and fashionable types of pottery are traveling as well. By the end of the pre-palatial period, the picture changes even more noticeably. In some places, clearly elite burials appear, with more jewelry, expensive items, and sometimes even more complex tomb architecture. And this means that equality has come to an end. A good example is necropolises like Moklas, where it's immediately clear that some people lived and died much wealthier than the others. There are already those on the island who control resources, trade, and possibly religious centers. Most of us associate the Minoan civilization with huge palace complexes with dozens of rooms, inner courtyards, and mysterious corridors. But these structures did not appear suddenly. They are the result of a long period of growth that lasted almost 1,000 years. All pre-palace era developments, population growth, crafts, early elites, and trade contacts. At some point, things overflowed, and centers appeared on the island that could no longer be called just settlements. Around 2100 to 1900 before Christ, the first large complexes appeared in Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, and Palekastro on Crete. Archaeologists call them palaces, but they were actually multifunctional centers for administrative, economic, and likely religious tasks, not royal residences. Goods were produced there, agricultural surpluses were stored, records were kept, rituals were performed, and people were gathered. These were the true hearts of their regions. It's important to remember that the familiar image of Knossos is more of a fantasy created by Arthur Evans in the early 20th century. Those bright columns and perfect walls are a reconstruction that creates the impression of a palace museum. The real complexes looked simpler and were much more functional. They consisted of multi-level rooms, inner courtyards, open roofs for ventilation, workshops, storage rooms, and even sewage systems that are impressive in terms of their technology. Life was bustling inside such centers. Craftsmen spun wool, wove fabrics, made jewelry, and worked with metal and stone. The huge number of loom weights found shows that it was in the palaces where fabric was produced, one of Crete's main export goods. The elite completely controlled metallurgy and pottery production. This was no longer a village craft, but organized production that required accounting and a clear distribution system. And it was at this moment that writing appeared in Crete. First Cretan hieroglyphs, then linear script. And these systems were not literary. They served to manage the economy, to count goods and resources. In other words, Minoan writing was essentially a tool for controlling the economy. At the same time, Crete was not a unified kingdom during this period. There were several centers on the island, each controlling its own territory. Most likely, it was a network of influential regional elites who governed their own districts and competed with each other. This period also saw increased external contacts. Crete actively trades with Egypt, the Middle East, the Cyclades, and Greece. Resources, technologies, and ideas pass through the island. Gradually, it turns into one of the most important crossroads of the Bronze Age. After the appearance of the first palaces, the Minoan civilization enters its brightest period, roughly between the 17th and 15th centuries before Christ. Crete turns into one of the largest cultural centers of the entire Eastern Mediterranean. At this time, the palaces are rebuilt, become larger, new buildings appear, and workshops are expanded. If the early complexes were still a test of strength, now we see real giants completely dominating their regions. It was during this era that the Minoans became so prominent in the Aegean Sea that scholars of the 19th and 20th centuries confidently declared them a maritime power, supposedly controlling all the surrounding sea. That's where the term thalassocracy comes from, rule over the sea. On paper, it looked impressive. Wealthy Crete, a powerful fleet, and King Minos, who kept the Aegean Sea under control. But modern research paints a very different picture. The Minoans did have ships, and they actively traded and traveled, but there was no military dominance over the Aegean region. On the contrary, Crete's influence spread gently through prestige, fashion, and status symbols. The elites of other islands and coasts simply liked the Minoan style, all that elegant pottery, jewelry, bright frescoes, and refined nature motifs. They eagerly copied it in their homes and sanctuaries. Archaeologists finding Minoan artifacts across the region indicates a trade network, not an empire. Crete thrived as a wealthy hub due to maritime trade. This is evidenced by findings in Egypt, where inscriptions mention people from Keftiu. This is probably what the Egyptians called the Minoans. Frescoes in a distinctly Minoan style have been found in Tel el-Dabaa, and no one fully understands how they got there. They could have been brought as goods, painted by invited craftsmen, or created by local artists inspired by Cretan motifs. Still, one thing is clear. Crete was an influential cultural center that drew attention far beyond the Aegean Sea. When you look at Minoan art, you get the feeling that you're seeing a civilization that is amazingly lively, light, and even a bit festive. Their frescoes don't look like strict symbols of power, but rather like scenes from a world where people love nature, animals, bright colors, and movement. But this impression is deceptive. Behind these images lies a culture with many rituals, a complex organization, and a world whose essence we know surprisingly little about. Minoan artists created images that stand out from the usual picture of the ancient world. If Egyptian frescoes are formality and canon, then Cretan ones are energy. People in motion, flexible figures, curved bodies, flowers, sea creatures. The pottery is adorned with octopuses whose tentacles stretch across the vessel's surface. On the walls, women in richly decorated garments, men leaping, scenes from gardens and groves. The small seals and rings with engraved scenes are considered the most mysterious. Scholars debate who we see in these images: goddesses, priestesses, rulers, or perhaps characters from a myth unknown to us. We understand too little about the social structure of Crete to confidently say who ruled, who served, and who performed the rituals. Religion is perhaps the most obscure aspect of their culture. We don't have a single surviving text that would explain their beliefs. All we know are material traces. There are sanctuaries on mountain peaks where people would climb to leave bronze daggers, figurines, or vessels. In caves that were considered entrances to the underworld, sacrificial items are also found. Sometimes more disturbing traces are discovered there: bones, which some researchers interpret as possible evidence of human sacrifices. Many finds include figurines of women holding snakes in their hands, the so-called snake goddesses. They are now a symbol of the civilization, though we don't know if they represent a goddess, priestess, housekeeper, or legendary figure. Snakes probably had ritual significance. They are associated with the earth, renewal, and the forces of nature. In Minoan culture, the prominence of female imagery is clear, but building a matriarchy theory from this is no longer common, unlike before. Bulls were significant. Their heads appeared on walls, they were paraded, their symbols placed in sanctuaries, and the famous bull leaping scene, still a mystery, is well known. Was it a sport, a ritual, a test, or something that we can't classify using modern categories at all? The fresco with acrobats leaping over the back of a bull is one of the most recognizable images of Crete, but its meaning remains a key lost to some important lock. Some Greek deities, like the goddess Ilithia, may have originated from Minoan ones. She was worshipped in Crete even before the arrival of the Greeks. It is possible that early forms of figures that later became Artemis, Athena, or other Olympians originated in Minoan religion. But all of this is speculation without written sources. We only see the outer shell of the culture, the beauty, the rituals, the symbols, but we do not hear its own voice. According to burial traditions, there was also diversity. In the east of the island, they preferred cute tholoi, while in the west, they used chamber tombs that resembled small family mausoleums. This again suggests that the Minoan civilization was not monolithic, but consisted of many local traditions. The brilliant Minoan world eventually changes. Their once eternal palaces slowly lose scale and influence. And although the popular version links the destruction of the Minoan civilization to the eruption of Santorini, it is now clear that things were much more complicated. The eruption was powerful, but Crete survived. The palaces remained functional, and the culture continued to develop. The real turning points happened later, around 1470 before Christ. New people appeared on the island, the Mycenaeans. This was already a Greek culture, military and hierarchical, formed on the mainland. They were impressed by the Minoan style, adopted a lot, copied a lot, and incorporated much into their own system of power. Unlike the Minoans, they spoke early Greek and used their own writing system. Linear B has been deciphered, and what's especially interesting is that most of the tablets with this script were found not in Greece, but specifically on Crete. This highlights the scale of change. Linear A vanishes, replaced by Greek texts throughout the palace archives. This meant Mycenaean administrators controlled the economy, archives, goods collection, and craft production. How they gained power is debated. Mainland Mycenaean states may have conquered the island, or Mycenaean groups might have migrated and gradually taken control. Taking advantage of Crete's political weakness, and perhaps with some of the Minoan elite voluntarily accepting their rule as stronger neighbors capable of maintaining order, one way or another, the world of Crete is changing. The palaces still operate, but differently. They're smaller, rebuilt, and repurposed. Some Minoan traditions vanish, while others survive in altered forms. Local centers may form, but authorities lack the wealth and organization they had before. There is a theory that some Minoans may have become part of the so-called Sea Peoples, who, a generation or two later, would be mentioned in Egyptian texts as the destroyers of cities in the eastern Mediterranean. This is just a hypothesis, but it highlights the situation's complexity. In the late Bronze Age, Crete gradually lost its independence, and by the 11th century before Christ, Greek tribes eventually settled the island. Rituals are forgotten, but even in the era of Homer, Crete preserves the memory of its former diversity. In the Iliad, several peoples of the island are mentioned at once, including the Eteocretans, whom Homer calls descendants of the ancient population. The memory of the Minoans endured for generations, even after their civilization vanished. Thank you for watching this story to the end. There are many more stories from the Bronze Age ahead. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell. See you in the next video. Bye everyone.